Now turn your Bibles to the book of Revelation, chapter 4. For this lesson today, I want to read chapter 4. I know it's a little bit of a lengthy reading, but the whole lesson is focused on this chapter for one reason. You'll see why. It's kind of like a narrative that focuses on one particular aspect, and we want to look at some significant perspectives on that. And so my study Bible has the title at the top of chapter 4 called The Throne in Heaven. Yours may have a title something like that at the top of chapter 4. After this I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven. And the voice I heard first, speaking to me like a trumpet, said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was a throne in heaven with someone sitting on it. And the one who sat there had the appearance of jasper and ruby. A rainbow that shone like an emerald encircled the throne. Surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and seated on them were 24 elders. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder. In front of the throne, 7 lamps were blazing. These are the 7 spirits of God. Also, in front of the throne, there was what looked like a sea of glass, clear as crystal. In the center, around the throne, were 4 living creatures, and they were covered with eyes in front and in back. The first living creature was like a lion, and the second was like an ox, and the third had the face like a man, and the fourth was like a flying eagle. Each of the 4 living creatures had 6 wings and was covered with eyes all around, even under its wings. Day and night they never stopped saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come." Whenever the living creatures give glory, honor, and thanks to him who sits on the throne and who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne, and they worship him who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne and say, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by all things they were created and have their being." Wow, what a scene. I especially refrained from putting up the next slide because I went through a lot of pictures. I couldn't find one I was completely satisfied with what I was seeing in my mind as I read this scene, because your picture might be even different from this too. But here's an artist representation of trying to pull together everything. This is one of the most imaginative, creative scenes of God's presence in heaven you'll find anywhere in the Bible. Now, it has echoes. There are a lot of parallels in the book of Ezekiel, some in Daniel, and some in Isaiah. And when you read some of those passages, you're like, oh, sounds kind of a lot like the same. And we don't have time this morning to look at the parallels to the Old Testament, but they certainly are there. Which as I read all this and I sort of sat back, I thought, I wonder why there are all these parallels. Well, it looks like, God, of course, is using the Spirit to communicate this, but in the most creative, imaginative way, it's trying to get the human mind to picture what God's presence in heaven must be like. And this is the best that human language can do. Okay? Because language is interesting. Think about this. language has a function that's very important. It names and labels things, and you can talk about it. But the problem is language also has its limitations. And we know this. Any event you've experienced, and I know John probably felt this too, and even putting together this picture of heaven in chapter 4, anytime you try to describe something, you know your description doesn't really do it justice. Okay, I'll give you an example. Have you ever used your camera or your digital iPhone? You take a picture and you look at it like, wait a minute, that's not as beautiful as it looks out here. You know, and you see that little bit of a disconnect there, because even cameras have their limitation of capturing reality. Well, language is kind of the same way. It helps, but it doesn't capture the full experience. So this morning, we're going to be looking at chapter 4, and I didn't realize this as specifically as I did this week. This whole chapter has to do with an essential fundamental perspective about the very essence of worship before God. It's amazing. And I ran across the realization that there's a lot of Christian speakers and writers that will use this expression. They call it throne room worship. That's the expression they use, throne room worship. And it is an attempt to say something like this: until I can get my heart and mind in a creative, imaginative way that I'm in the very presence of God when I worship, then really my worship's kind of empty. And so what we want to do is look at chapter 4 and see if it gives us some wonderful guidance and insights into what we need to be aware of when we approach God in worship. So we're going to be looking at that today. It starts as a major transition here, which is kind of fascinating. Chapter 4, verse 1, after this I looked. Well, after the experience of the 7 spirits or angels giving the message to the 7 churches, after this I looked, and here's what I saw. And what's amazing is he's going to move from the content and the message of letters to this extraordinary, visionary spiritual experience that it's incredible. And it's fascinating. And I really thought a lot about this yesterday. It's fascinating that what is going to happen here in Revelation is going to move from the struggles and the problems of earthly congregations and people with all their problems. And it's going to shift from there and move us into the very presence of God in heaven. Like, wow. So here's what I want to throw out for a possibility. Could it be that it is only through worship and understanding that we're in the presence of God collectively, giving God all the honor and praise and glory and thanks that's due to Him, that it's only through worship that somehow we have enough strength from God to face the everyday reality of church and world that really isn't what it needs to be. And I think I'm making an argument that it's through the lens of worship that we can see life as we ought to. It puts things in perspective. I'll give you an Old Testament example to prove this. David does this. Remember in the Psalms, David said, I looked around and I couldn't believe how well off other people were. And I just began to envy them. And then he makes this comment, but it wasn't until I went into the house of the Lord that I saw their end. So there was something that David experienced in temple worship that day, just that reminded him of God and priorities and destiny and all that. He was able to put into perspective all these people that were really making it well off, and he thought, man, I wish I was one of them. You know, worship does that. Do you feel when you come, when you assemble, does the worship help reorient you and make sure that you are living on that solid foundation of God and Christ and the Spirit and your faith? That's what worship ought to do. It grounds us, okay? So important. Um, the imaginative, creative, dynamic picture is given of how and why God is worthy of our worship. The actual Old English word worship means reverence toward that which is worthy, or worthyship, and it comes out worship, but it's worshiping God who is worthy. Traditionally, this chapter 4 has been understood in the highest expression in Scripture of our ultimate worship. So today, I want us to highlight 5 dimensions of worship to get our mind around what is it that God is looking for and how can we be sure that we're pleasing God. First, that worship is directed toward the throne. In this particular chapter, John is invited to come into the presence of God. And I believe that that's exactly what worship is. It invites us into the presence of God. I first had this insight years ago from a devotional book that I was reading, and I'll never forget the person's comment. The person said, because it kind of went against what I thought worship was at that time, the person said, singing, Bible reading, prayer, Lord's Supper, just things that we kind of think of as worship on Sunday. He said, that's not really worship. Those are just channels of God-approved activities to lead us into the very presence of God, which is worship. And I thought, oh, okay. And this is what John is showing here, that worship is a way in which we can sense ourselves being in the presence of God. Okay? He says, come up here. It's interesting because that's sort of a heavenward posture. Come up here and I'll show you. And I think that it helps us understand that worship lifts us up toward God. And it's interesting to me that in the New Testament, both heaven and a life that is centered on God is always pictured as upward. And that's a fascinating thing. Well, in our prayer life, what happens with prayer? Lift up your prayers. See, prayers go up. Worship toward God is upward. Okay? So it's a fascinating concept. And I think the reason for it is it makes us realize how dependent we are on God. And there's a certain dimension of upward that I physically can't go. And think about that. We can only go upward so far. Some of us can only jump a few inches. And then we've even tried with our nation, go to the moon, we go upward that far, but we can't go to the ultimate upward in the very presence of God as it is pictured here. John says, or the Spirit says, I'll show you what must take place. And so I believe that worship at one level is a preparation for us to see, at least to be prepared to see what is going to happen and what does happen in the world. We interpret, think about this. Don't let the newscasters interpret world events for you and swallow their comments hook, line, and sinker. That is not the last comment on world events. Okay? John, in his experience, is really showing us how to let worship be the lens through which we interpret the world. He says that once I was in the Spirit, worship is offered by those of us who are in the Spirit. Now, for John, in the Spirit, took on what would we call a visionary experience. It's almost like he was outside of himself and lifted upward into the very presence of God in heaven in a way that we don't. And yet we recognize if we're going to approach God in worship, it needs to be done in the Spirit. Kind of reminds me of John's comment. You know, we need to worship God in spirit and in truth. You pull both of those together to be pleasing to God. And then the worship is directed toward the throne, and from the throne came flashes of lightning and rumbling and peals of thunder, just like last night. And I don't know, it was around I told Nancy, it was 2 or 3 in the morning. Man, we had a big bolt of lightning it about knocked me out of bed last night. Wow. So yeah, we had storms last night. Larry, thank you. I was going to get on this morning. I didn't have time. I knew that they were talking about potential, for bad weather and tornadoes last night. But it's interesting, and I read a commentary last night, and we don't have time to track this down. Several places in the Bible where God's presence is known to human beings, God's presence is accompanied with lightning and thunder and earthquake and all those kind of manifestations. And I was thinking, I wonder why that's true. And I believe part of the reason is it's to demonstrate the majestic sovereignty of God, that even the earth itself and the heavens themselves quake and rumble and shake at the very presence of God, the Creator. The next thing is worship is around the divine presence. Notice the one who sat there, and I love the way this is worded. Verse 3, and the one who sat there. What you would think, based on what people think about God, you would think the description would be the one who sat there had white hair and a long beard. Doesn't say that. Does not say that. And interestingly, when it gives a description of God's appearance, it uses precious stones of all things. Isn't that weird? You normally would not think of using precious stones to describe somebody's appearance, but that's what he does. Jasper and ruby. And I believe jasper, and actually the word ruby, I think the ESV translates it Chaldean or something like that. It's actually the word Sardonian, which is, you remember we read the letter to Sardis? There was a stone that was famous coming out of the area of Sardis, and this is a reference to that precious stone. So you have these precious stones being described of God's presence, then a rainbow that shone like an emerald encircled the throne. So it's kind of fascinating to think about a rainbow that is mainly green. Because when you think of the rainbow, what do you think of? The range of colors. Well, here, this rainbow is basically emerald and green. It encircles the throne. And with the one who is sitting on the throne, this is the posture of divine sovereign rule. So fundamentally and basically, every time we worship God, the first and foremost thing that we're doing is acknowledging the sovereign majesty, rule, and reign of God over the world and in our hearts. Worship is all about who God is. And I was thinking yesterday, I had to go to Walmart. My iPhone, I don't know if yours has this. It has the feature where you can turn on a microphone and it will record what you're saying. And then I can send my words to my email and print it off on a piece of paper. So it's amazing how technology can do that. And I almost took out my iPhone and just started recording all the things that I'm aware of in American culture with church at large that isn't God-centered. And I'm just afraid that much of American worship, just across the board, from what I can tell, has turned into entertainment. And you don't get, I don't, maybe I'm missing something. I don't get the feeling that it's God-centered. I think it's audience-centered. At least that's what I'm seeing. And if this chapter critiques us at all, it challenges us always to make sure that when we are assembled as God's people, everything that we say and do is to honor God. And we have to ask ourselves, is what we're doing collectively as God's people for worship, is it honoring God? And if not, then we shouldn't do it. or if we're leaving something out that we should do, we need to do that. Very important. So worship is around the divine presence of God. Now we're getting into some fascinating things. Worship is from some of these creatures and people we're trying to identify here. There were leaders, elders they're called, 24 thrones surrounding the one throne. And the thing that I like, this was one of the few that pictured, because notice the first reference to the 24 elders sitting on the throne, it says they're sitting on the throne. But guess what happened? There's a follow-up action, and we're going to talk about it, that the elders get down and they prostrate themselves toward the feet of the one who is on the throne. So, what is this a reference to? Because they're dressed in white and they had golds of crown on their head. The best guess is that probably this 24 is coming from the Old Testament, referring to the administration of the Levitical priests. There was the order of 24, and they were considered as elders and priests in Israel, and they would take their rotation in guiding the ritual around the temple. It may be that here these 24 represent elders, leaders of the church, who the reason they're in white is because they have suffered persecution. The golden crown means they have stayed faithful unto death, and they have those victorious crowns on their head. And it may be that the 24 is a way of saying all of God's people, but particularly thinking in terms of leaders in the church who have been persecuted, perhaps even martyred, and they are before the throne worshiping God. Then there's the 7 lamps and the 7 spirits. Perhaps that's the faithful martyrs from some of the 7 churches already, that they're in the forever presence worshiping God. In front of the throne, there is what looks like a sea of glass, or clear as crystal. In the ancient world, crystal was highly prized, more than it is for us. Although we think of crystal as being precious. I was reading where one of the Roman Neros was aware that there was a crystal goblet that in our day and time, historians sort of evaluate, bump it up to our English dollar, but it was sold for about $1 million. And one of the Roman historians talk about that. Well, one of the Roman Neros, when he found out that he wasn't going to get the support of the Senate, he was so angry that he went into a house and he took some of the most precious crystal he could find and just crashed it on the floor. That was the ultimate insult in the ancient world, something that was that expensive. Well, crystal was very, very precious. And so it carries that idea of being a sea of glass, clear as crystal before the throne. It's sort of the almost incalculable measure of the preciousness of God. It's such a beautiful part of that picture, it's even hard to put into words. And then the description of the 4 living creatures. Like, wow, look at these. Notice that they've got eyes all around them, okay? They even have eyes under their wings, and looks like even on top of the wings. But the first one was a creature like a lion. The second is like an ox. The third said had a face like a man, and the fourth was like a flying eagle. And they have 6 wings. And 2 was for flying, 2 was for covering their feet, and 2 was for covering their face and their breasts. So you've got, it looks like acts of humility and the ability, and this is where I wish we had more footnotes to guide us on interpreting this. But when you look at these 4 creatures, the lion in the ancient world would represent power, fear. You didn't tangle with a lion. and an ox would be strength. The man would be human reasoning. The fourth would be a flying eagle and freedom. But each of these come before God with an ultimate expression of submission. And this is important because guess what the 24 elders do? They do the same thing. We're going to see that in a moment. But notice that this worship is never ending. Day and night, it's the unending nature of worship. And it broadens our concept of tradition. I used to always think of this. Worship is you start at 11 on Sunday morning and you finish at noon. That's worship. And I think Nancy and I were talking about this the other day to some couples. When I was at an earlier church that we used to work at, I remember that there was a gentleman who had his watch with him. And if we went over 12 noon, he'd look at his watch and then he was gone. I mean, even if we're in the middle of a communion, you get up, walk, he's out of here, he's done. Okay. And then one time, and I think he was just pulling my leg because he knew. I thought, really? So one morning he held up his watch where I could see it. He was going like this, see if his watch was still working. But we think traditionally worship, 1 hour. Well, this whole concept is challenged in that when we look at this scene, it never stops. And it goes along with the New Testament concept of worship that broadens and builds off of the Old Testament. Here's what's interesting. In the Old Testament, the priest would do a lot of things on behalf of the people and often would serve as a mediator between God and the people. Well, when the New Testament comes along, that old order is replaced so that one of the greatest teachings, and this is what Martin Luther and the Reformation movement restored to Christianity, because Catholicism and other forms of medieval Christianity had lost this. You can't do anything with God unless you go through a priest. Well, in 1 Peter, we read very clearly, every Christian is a priest. So the Reformation movement restored the idea of the priesthood of all believers. And the reason I'm saying this is because it's interesting. Through the years, I've had a few people in our churches that don't understand this. And I remember one lady, the very first time that I heard this, it kind of took me aback. She goes, "Would you pray to God for me because you're closer to the man upstairs than I am?" I was like, wait a minute, what? Wait. Back the truck up. I'm not closer to the man upstairs than you are. That's the idea of me being a priest. You pray to God. I mean, I don't mind praying for you and being involved in intercessory prayer. That's perfectly legitimate. But don't think that you can only go to God through me. No. So that's what this is all about. New Testament worship. It's broader than just the hour on Sunday. It's performed by the priesthood of all believers and expressed in all of life, not just altar ritual or formalism on Sunday morning. Paul says this, Romans 12. I beseech you, therefore, by the mercies of God, that you what? Present your bodies as a living sacrifice. He says this is your true and spiritual worship before God. Really? So offering my body is a form of worship? Yes, it is. And it makes you understand that the idea of worship is that my whole life stands before God. My whole life ought to honor God. And when we see that, it makes sense. And then last of all, worship is expressed in 3 ways. And it's interesting that in the Restoration movement, Alexander Campbell and other early pioneers of the movement felt that if we could come up with the original pattern of worship, that would unite Christians. Well, that sounds simple, and it certainly wasn't ever accomplished. Instead of just looking at specifics of a pattern that we think might be there, and here's something that's interesting. Let me throw this out for you. Someone made this comment years ago. You know how we have what is called, people call worship wars. People fight over and have conflict over what worship ought to look like on Sunday. And that's called worship wars. Said, well, the first worship war was between Cain and Abel, and somebody got killed in that one. So they disagreed over worship to God back then. So it's always been a very tough thing. Well, if we think in terms of, and this is fascinating, we put such a high priority on the very thing we do on Sunday morning during the hour, and we want it to be right. You know, we don't want to do anything wrong. But here's the thing that just blows my mind. Have you realized in the New Testament, we don't have an order of worship in one of the pages from any of the churches? You would think that probably one of the best places in the book of Revelation for an order of worship would be to those 7 churches. John could say, okay, y'all even have worship wrong on Sunday morning. Here's what it needs to look like. It would have been a perfect spot for that. But that's not even in there. So there's some latitude there. But what I want to focus on, let's look at foundational approach to worship as it is experienced in chapter 4 and see if that can help be a good foundation to build other thoughts and practices on worship as we think about honoring God. The first, let me see if I put it on here. No, I'll go back. The first is worship is about saying and verbalizing to God His own worthiness to be worshiped. Did you notice when I read this, here's what we ascribe to God: glory, honor, power, and thanks. Those 4 things. So we have to ascribe that. And I thought, wouldn't it be neat if you had time to go back and look at all of our songs and see if they do that, if they give glory and honor, power, and thanks to God. What about our prayer life? If we had recorded every single prayer that's ever been prayed on Sunday morning here, could we go back and look at them and see if they do indeed accomplish that? Well, notice the second thing. And this is the posture of the 24 elders. They fall down before the very presence of God. In the ancient world, this is where you kind of have to be careful of making something a strict legal requirement. But in the ancient world, worship was always accompanied with the position of the body, always. That's why you get, and we miss it, when Paul tells Timothy, I pray that all men everywhere, what? Lift up hands without wrath and doubting and praying to God. Well, when was the last time you raised your hand when praying to God? That was ancient practice. Worship. Prostrating yourself down, face down, hands down, kneeling like that. That was understood in the ancient world as part of worship. Look at the picture up there. That's exactly what we're talking about. Now, what if next week you come to worship and I said, okay, every one of you down on your knees, prostrate like this? Well, I think it would be making a requirement that I don't really see there as a requirement, but here's where it challenges us. Do we think of body language in terms of helping us with the very next action? And what else did they do? They cast down their crowns. Well, the first, kneeling like this, is posture of worship, which we would say, boy, it's got to be in the attitude and the heart, because that would obviously have to precede getting down on your knees. But notice the other thing. The crowns that these 24 elders were wearing are victory crowns, and they're made of gold this time. But what do? Instead of being proud of what they had accomplished and proud of the fact that perhaps they're martyrs for the faith, they come before the very presence of God. They take that crown off, and as they're kneeling before God, they offer the crown to God in total submission and humility. It's not like one of them sits up with the crown on their head and says, God, I'm so glad I'm here because I deserve to be. No, none of the 24 said that. No, they're all in this posture. In fact, there's a Christian singing group, I don't know if y'all are aware of this, called Casting Crowns. Have you heard of that group? And so what they do is they get that name from this chapter 4 in the book of Revelation. but they're laid down, they cast down their crowns. It is total humility and submission. And so I would suggest that it's sort of like pouring a concrete foundation, that the very foundation we're pouring, when we think about worship, we're saying and we're verbalizing to God his own worthiness to be worshiped with glory, honor, power, and thanks. And that in our minds, at the very least, we're thinking of our hearts taking a position of kneeling, so that we're falling down before God with a posture of obedience and submission. And laying down the crowns before the throne, it forces us to humility. Have you noticed in just the songs that we sing, how many songs refer to being humble-minded, being and having humility, and knowing that we're at the mercy of God? So many of our songs highlight that. So this idea of humility is at the very core of worship. There's a strong message here in this translation or transition of Revelation. The problems of the church and God's people are best addressed as they're expressed in worship, and that's the lens through which we make sense of our world, and we have God's presence among us, so that we're not only worshiping God, but we're encouraging one another. And it's expressed in a way that we know it is our Lord God who is worthy of worship. And I believe that it's an important corrective for today's contemporary view of worship, that we need to look at Revelation chapter 4 to get our minds around thinking, imaginative, creatively, with eyes of the heart, as Paul would say, that when we worship God, we're coming into his presence. It's about God. It's not about us. So this is a powerful lesson in Revelation chapter 4.